Good morning to you. Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Daring Dialogues. I'm your host, Shantae Charles. I'm looking a little pale today, so I need some sun. So I'm really hoping that the sun comes out today so I can get out. And my melanin needs some help today. All right, enough of my jokes for this morning. So good morning, everyone. Most of you all know that this is Wednesday, Winsday. All right. And on Wednesday, we like to help us with our relationships. So what does that mean? I'm glad you asked. That means that we are going to talk about what we need to do in order to improve our marriages for those who are married. And we're continuing on with the topic of the history of dating. And we have started talking about school and how education and how school plays a part in people being able to find their mate, and what happened with school, what happened with co-ed education, and how that played a part in the quote-unquote dating scene. All right, but we are going to start first with our book by Tony Evans, Kingdom Marriage. And believe it or not, we are roughly, I would say, 2/3 through this book. So if you've been reading along with us, this will be another book you can knock off of your reading for this year. And we are in chapter 11, and he's going to be talking about romance. Romance. So my Periscope viewers, if you are on here, please make sure that you either comment in the comment box or you press heart so I can know that Periscope is not acting up again today. I just saw it freeze for a moment, so make sure that you're able to communicate with me and let me know that everything is good on your side. All right, so he's going to start out by talking about romance, and he's going to help us to understand from the scriptural standpoint about romance and sexual intimacy. So this is going to be quite good over the next couple of sessions that we cover this chapter. Thank you, Lady Andrea, for tweeting this out. Thank you for those of you who are tweeting this out as we begin. In Labor of Love, as I said, we're going to continue talking about co-ed education and how that played a part in dating. All right, so let's begin with our section on romance. I hope you have a pen and paper today, because I believe he's going to give you some terms that you might want to look up yourself and do some more in-depth study. And if you have something to drink, I hope you do. I do today. Romance. I want you to remember, if you are married, I want you to remember the first time you kissed your spouse. It shouldn't be hard. Most of us can recall that moment of anticipation, the buildup of hormones and emotions, and the culmination of coming together. In fact, scientists have researched the effects of kissing. All right? So all the preachers out here, you should be super excited about the research on kissing. All right? So you can take notes, so you can back up the boundaries that you're teaching on for those who want your advice. And there's my lovely, wonderful husband saying, "Ooh, yes, perfect intro. Good morning, love." The first time you kissed your spouse, all right? In fact, scientists have researched the effects of kissing along with the transmission of sensory data that takes place, and concluded that kissing is one of the most profound things a person can do. So as a parent, you can explain that to your young adult, to your teenager who wants to be laying their lips on any and every one. All right? If you're like me and you had a childhood like mine, we played spin the bottle. Some of you are probably too young to know what spin the bottle is, but we played that game. All right? But the research showed that kissing is one of the most profound things a person can do. So if that is the case, then we want to be careful about who we lay our lips on. And the impact of a kiss, when all things line up right, can leave an even more powerful sensory imprint on our brains than something as major as the first time a person ever has sex. So I'm going to say that again because I see my Periscope is freezing for some reason. All right? It can leave an even more powerful sensory imprint on our brains than something as major as the first time a person ever had sex. So a kiss can leave a more impactful imprint than sex. All right? All right, Mr. Jokes. Whether it's magic or a disaster, writes Cheryl Kirschenbaum, author of The Science of Kissing, there is one thing that a first kiss is very likely to be: unforgettable. Psychologist John Bohannon of Butler University and his research team surveyed 500 people to compare their recollections of a variety of significant life experiences, such as a first kiss and the loss of virginity, to find out what made the most dramatic impression. A first kiss trumped everything. It was the most vivid memory in the minds of those being surveyed. In fact, when asked about specifics, Bohannon reported that most people could recall up to 90% of the details of the moment, where they were, who made the first move, and no matter how long ago the exchange took place. There is a biological reason for this that God in his infinite wisdom has created within us. Over the centuries, we have only had the ability to experience romantic love rather than to study it. Anthropologists have discovered evidence of the existence of romantic love in 170 different societies, yet they have never found a society in which it did not exist. Romance has been around from as far back as we can determine, and it even shows up as the major emphasis in an entire book of the Bible, the Song of Solomon. Now, I remember when I was a single person, I got lots of very, very good counsel about not reading the Song of Solomon while I was single, because that book is very intensely romantic and it will make you want to go out and find a mate. So, when I was coming up, all right, in the faith, people would say things like, if you don't want to awaken sexual desire, Song of Solomon might be a book of the Bible that you might want to stay away from. All right. So that entire book, Song of Solomon, is a very sexual and deeply romantic book. I don't know why people think that God is not approved of sexuality or romance within the confines of marriage, but there are people out there who have that view. But Song of Solomon clearly proves them wrong. Okay? Romance is such a powerful part of who we are because God has created us in such a way that we attach to our romantic partner based not only on our thoughts, interactions, and conversations with each other, but on our senses. Yet, as scientific research has shown us, the parts of our brain that are aroused through romance aren't necessarily the same parts that are aroused through sex. Romance that evokes emotions of love often involves a complex transference of biological signals, including smell, touch, and taste. That's why kissing is critical to long-term attachment. As we kiss, God has designed our blood vessels to dilate, thus providing our brains with more oxygen. Scientists have also observed that our pupils dilate when we kiss. An open mouth kiss allows nearly 10,000 taste buds on our tongues to transmit additional information to our brains, which then responds by producing certain hormones designed to, when people talk about physical bonds, when they talk about emotional bonds, when they talk about what is coined soul ties, all right? When they talk about soul ties, this is why even if you haven't had sex with someone and you're trying to break off the relationship, and you now have some soul ties because you've done some of this. All right? You can't get that person out of your mind because you have tasted and seen something you probably shouldn't have tasted with them. All right? So, though the older folks would say it like this: we don't want you to kiss because kissing leads to other stuff. Kissing leads to the act. And we would say to the older people, oh, you all are just kidding. Don't be so serious about it. It's just a kiss. Well, the science shows otherwise. So go ahead and thank all of the older people in your life who tried to warn you that there's more to kissing than just your lips on someone else's. All right? It produces hormones designed to strengthen attachment between two people. All right? So if you don't know if you like the person yet, if you don't know if you're really into them, you might not want to lay lips on them because you're strengthening an attachment that you may want to disconnect from, and it probably is going to be harder for you to disconnect. Cheryl Kirschenbaum writes that, quote, kissing also promotes the love hormone. Again, thank your elders because they tried to tell you this. Kissing also promotes the love hormone, oxytocin, which works to maintain a special connection between two people. Kissing can keep love alive when a relationship has survived decades, long after novelty has worn off. In other words, kissing influences the uptake of hormones and neurotransmitters beyond our conscious control. And these signals play a huge part in how we feel about each other. A bad kiss, alternatively, can lead to chemical chaos. An uncomfortable environment or a poor match can stimulate the stress hormone or cortisol, discouraging both partners from continuing. Most married couples can attest that it's possible to have sexual relations without romance, but it's rare to have romance without sex. Of course, there are times when one spouse may not be able to have sex due to age or illness, but if the romance is there and both are able, sex is the natural culmination of shared romantic affection. Some of this is because when romantic ties are stimulated in our bodies and brains, our bodies respond by producing chemicals that create a desire for deeper connection and bonds more so than by sex. This explains why counselors who encourage struggling couples to increase their sexual activity are ineffective. They aren't focusing on the core component of love. After 4 decades of counseling hundreds and hundreds of struggling couples, I've heard more often than not that it's possible to have sex when you are not in love. Sex doesn't create love. It's intended as the culmination of love. Thus, couples who are struggling in their relationships need to focus on rekindling both their connection and their romance, whether that's through kind words, actions, listening, or intimate kissing and non-sexual touch before looking to regain or reignite the sexual chemistry they may have once shared. Sex without a foundation of romance will not restore a relationship. We all know that sexual intimacy involves much more than two bodies enjoying physical contact with each other and exchanging a pleasurable experience. If that were all that was necessary for intimate bonding to occur, then prostitutes would have the most emotionally, physically, and spiritually intimate relationships in the world, and we know that they do not without romance. All right. Tony Evans writes, I'll never forget an experience I had a few years ago. I had been preparing to preach a sermon series on knowing God intimately when I stumbled upon one of the most revealing principles on sexuality I'd ever encountered. It came under the umbrella of what it means to know God. But as I looked at the original Hebrew language, I discovered that Scripture had couched this truth of spiritual intimacy with God in the midst of something that matters deeply to all of us, human intimacy with each other, in particular with our spouses. I learned in seminary many years back that whenever you approach the study of Scripture, and in particular when you are seeking to discover the meaning of a specific phrase, word, or principle, it is best to use the hermeneutical law of first mention. The concept of origination is an important tool in the Bible. According to this study practice, the original meaning tied to a word or principle is to stand contiguous through future uses of the same word or principle unless the biblical text itself instructs you to change it at a later point. With that in mind, the first mention of sexual intimacy occurs in Genesis 4, verse 1. Now, the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth. Were we to look at the original language, we would discover that the word translated had relations in English is the Hebrew word yada. You know, like yada, yada, yada. All right. Yada is the word in Genesis 4 and 1. It is the identical word used earlier when the eyes of Adam and Eve were opened and they knew they were naked. It is also the same word used in Genesis 3 and 22 when the Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." Although this word yada in Genesis 4 and 1 speaks of something we would call sex or physical intimacy today, the word itself doesn't refer to body parts or physical activity. In more than 1,000 occurrences of the word, it has these meanings. It has the definition to cause to know, to reveal oneself, to be made known, and to know. All right, so for those of you who are taking notes or screenshotting, here you go. When the word yada is used with a relational connection, whether that connection is human to human or human to God, it reveals a depth of plummeting into the reality of another person in order to know deeply and be deeply known. So intimate is this term when used as the first mention to introduce sexual relations in Scripture, that when applied to God, it is included in some of the most personal interactions we can have with Him. So some of those interactions are Isaiah 45 verse 3, which says, "I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden wealth of secret places, so that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you by your name." Psalm 25 verse 14, "The secret of the Lord is for those who fear Him, and will make them know," or yada, His covenant. And then Isaiah 43 verse 10, "You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know, or yada, and believe me. In these passages, we read about treasures of darkness, being chosen, the Lord's secret, and secret places. These words refer to our relationship with God, but we also use them with one another in a close marital tie, which, ding, 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 lets me know something about God. God is not just revealing his treasures, his secrets, and his secret places to people who are not in an intimate relationship with him. One thing is true about secrets. You either have to be in close proximity to whisper them, or at a minimum, you have to be close in trust to share them. God says that we are close to him in that way when we yada, or know him. True sexual intimacy, which includes the romantic ties of knowing and being known, shares much more than moments of passion. It is experienced because two people share secrets, they share their biology, they share their chemistry, they share their pheromones, they share their fears, their failure, their hopes, their dreams, their trust, and even more. Through a romantic bond with each other, couples find the most authentic form of love possible. In fact, the very secret nature of what they share becomes its own treasure. Most married couples have frequent insight because there are certain things that they have either said in the privacy with each other, or certain things they know about each other that other people don't know, where they can share moments of private humor. All right. So after all, what makes a secret a secret? It is a secret because no one else shares in it. And here is one of the downsides of our current culture of social media, where people overshare and feel that they have to share every single thing about their relationship with the world. All right? So please, married people, be aware that there are some things about your relationship that shouldn't be on social media. All right? There's a level of intimacy that's involved, that is building, and that is constructed for you and your spouse alone. All right? And unfortunately, this is why some people don't realize or wonder why someone else is able to get a foothold or gain a foothold into their marital relationship, because you're oversharing. Can't say that again without somebody getting offended. You're oversharing. There are certain things about my husband that I know about my husband that nobody else should know. Can I say that again? Let me say it again because my screen froze. There are certain things that I know about my spouse and my spouse knows about me that nobody else should know. Why? Because it's not their business. All right? And so I know we're in the era of social media where everybody is trying to, in some ways, I would call it prostituting their relationships, whether it is marriage, whether it is their relationship with their children. We're just putting things out there for likes and shares and views, not understanding that certain things that happen in your household should be between you and your family, should be between you and your spouse, not because you're trying to sell a product and not because you're trying to get a sponsorship deal. All right? You're supposed to be building a family first, a family, a unit, and some things that you will go through as a family does not necessarily need to be for public consumption. All right. Let me continue, and then we're going to stop at a good place for today. All right. The same is true in sex and romance. When either married individual shares that aspect of intimacy with someone outside of the marriage covenant, He or she has broken the sacredness of the secret treasure once shared with his or her spouse. When that happens, this bond of yada morphs from what God intended it to be into what Satan sought to corrupt it into, which is known in scripture. Oh God. So you go from yada, and this next word, you're going to know what it is because our culture is literally inundated with it. You go from the sexual intimacy that's supposed to be experienced in marriage, you go to this word, known in scripture as porneo. Selah. Or shakab. So we keep we're wondering, why do we have such a pornographic culture? We have such a pornographic culture because of the breakdown of sexual intimacy and covenant that's supposed to be shared in marriage. Just let that sink in. All right. These biblical terms refer to the exact same act of sexuality as yada, but they remove the sacred nature of the act and replace it with the shallowness of commonality. So, yada is something that happens in marriage. So when people say, well, what's the difference? That's the difference. One is considered a sacred sexual act. The others take away the sacredness of the act and just give you sex. And if you look at the number of people who are affected by porn addiction and the conversations around it, you will understand that many of people who are on this side will tell you that it is very hard to engage in this because they have spent a lot of time objectifying male or female. So it is very hard for them to do sex. They struggle with sacred sex. They struggle with sexual intimacy because of porn addiction. All right. In doing so, the individuals involved have removed one of the main purposes and intentions of sexuality, the exclusive bonding, emotionally, spiritually, and chemically that allows for knowing and being known. When sex becomes nothing more than an activity to perform for its own end, it brings with it heartbreak, jealousy, regret, and emotional, physical, and spiritual consequences. This is true even in marriages, as we see the term shakab used for sexual relations between Jacob and Leah, the wife he did not love. If you read about Jacob and Leah's marriage in Genesis 29, you will discover that it was full of pain, of loss, of regret, and conflict. Here are some other instances in scripture where the term shakab is used instead of yada. 2 Samuel 11, all right? When David was being sexually intimate with Bathsheba, he was not yadaing her, all right? Genesis 34, when Shechem raped Jacob's daughter Dinah, when he defiled her, that was the term that was used. Genesis 35 verse 22, when Reuben had sexual relations with Bilhah. 2 Samuel 13, when Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar, David's daughter. And Genesis 19 verses 30 through 38, when Lot's daughters committed incest with their father. So there is a definite difference between yada and porneo and shakab. Sex in and of itself is not intimacy that leads to a deeper relational tie. Married couples can have sex during their entire marriage and yet never experience yada. This is because yada involves much more than an action. It includes the elements of romantic attachment, desire, cultivation, and commitment regarding another person, which lead to a depth of knowing in a marriage. This is the kind of intimacy that arouses feelings of satisfaction, contentment, happiness, and joy with each other on an ongoing basis. It has often been said that sex doesn't begin in the bedroom, it begins in the kitchen. But actually, sex doesn't begin in the bedroom or the kitchen. It actually begins in the brain. All right. So we're going to stop there for today. We will be back continuing this talk on romance. Let us move on for our single people to our book, Labor of Love by Mara Weigel. And we're talking about the dating scene and the rise of the dating scene through co-ed college education. The rise of co-ed college education drove the rise of dating. Between 1890 and 1920, the number of students attending college in the United States tripled. By 1927, a majority of colleges had also become co-ed. Higher education had long interested Americans, but because of their belief in self-improvement, co-education added a dash of sex appeal. In the 1920s and 30s, the growth of the national mass media and entertainment industries fueled a college craze. The new advertising industries use images of well-dressed students to promote new goods. New clothing lines marketed popular articles of clothing, such as College Style. An army of writers, both fiction and nonfiction, told a broader public how to imitate college courtship patterns. They created two archetypal characters, the college man and the co-ed. Some disciplinarians tried to hold the college man and the co-ed to old standards. Campus YMCAs, churches offered regular mixers. Deans exhorted young men to call on female classmates they met at such events in the parlors of their dormitories or take them for a stroll. Yet even stubborn traditionalists had to recognize that they were fighting a losing battle. The college man and co-ed mixed freely. The opening pages of the 1922 short story collection, Town and Gown, showed the provincial Peter Warshaw arriving at the unnamed state school where he will study. Peter is frankly overwhelmed. The passing and repassing of students was dizzying. Fur-coated co-eds with rouged cheeks, men wearing horn-rimmed glasses, an instructor or two hurrying with bags in hand, Chinese students in groups, two colored girls, hesitant and self-effacing, couples who sauntered, glancing about to interacting with far more classmates than he had at home. He also had to master a new, strange language. The terms that college men and co-eds tossed around changed fast. Varsity Novels devoted a lot of space to slang, dropping terms. In his best-selling debut, This Side of Paradise, F. Scott Fitzgerald constantly offered definitions. A chapter devoted to petting spent less time on love and sex than on how kids gossiped about it. A riff on quote-unquote popular daughter, or PD, sets a chain of definitions falling like dominoes. The belle had become the flirt. The flirt had become the baby vamp. In The Male Fusser, these girls met their match. Even if you arrived at school sexually experienced, learning to talk constituted a key part of your higher education. In The Star of Town and Gown, Anthony Prothero was the champion fusser of a state university that made all of its activities competitive. Andy kissed a girl when he was 14. By 16, he could, quote unquote, love them up. But during his first year at State University, he develops a new line. He learned to use the term pet instead of loving up and fuss instead of stall. He learns to dress the part with a tiny mustache, shell-rimmed spectacles, tight-fitting gray coat, and silk gloves. Greetings and all that rot, he says, like he is bored already. Over the course of Town and Gown, we see him use this same line on multiple co-eds. Andy is a Greek, a fraternity member. Any college man worth dating, supposedly, was a Greek. A pretty co-ed could hope to climb the social ladder on the basis of her looks, but the Barb, short for barbarian or non-Greek, face steeper odds. In the 1920s, fraternities were at the center of campus life. For several decades, they have been expanding rapidly. In 1883, there were 505 fraternity chapters and 16 sorority chapters nationwide. In 1912, there were 1,560. By 1930, that number had climbed to 3,900, and 35% of all undergraduates were Greek. Fraternities and sororities became ground zero of college dating. And if you went to college, you know that. You know that if you pledged, all right, I didn't care how socially inept you were or how can I put it, unappealing you were, all right, if you pledged, that was supposed to give you a sort of social advantage in terms of attracting dates, all right? That was even when I was in college, all right? But because I had certain feelings about it, there were certain things that I said I was not going to do, and one of them was date a Greek. I know, I was a little discriminatory. Worked out perfectly fine for me, though. So people had their preferences, right? Some people wanted to date Greeks. Some people, like myself, was like, I'm staying completely away from Greeks and Greek culture. But supposedly for your social life, if you were a Greek, you were sort of guaranteed more of a shot at having a dating relationship or having more people want to date you. All right. And that's still true today. So this was going on in the 1930s, and that attitude and that sentiment, for the most part, is still there on college campuses. In the life of the college man centered on Fraternity Row, the life of the co-ed centered on the college men who lived on Fraternity Row. At least it was supposed to, according to the books that college men wrote about her after graduation. In this, she was very different from her predecessors. So the co-ed term here is actually relating to college women. The first generation of American women who attended universities in the 1870s and 1880s had inspired an outpouring from experts arguing that education would desex them. The psychologist G. Stanley Hall, for instance, warned that earning a bachelor's degree would leave a woman functionally castrated. All right? That's early thought on women getting an education. Many of them did indeed remain single. Of those educated at Bryn Mawr between 1889 and 1908, 53% never married. At Wellesley and the University of Michigan, the figures were 43% and 47%. They may not have minded. Women's colleges like Mount Holyoke were described as hotbeds of special sentimental friendships where female students fell in love at first sight and engaged in smashing, cuddling, and kissing in their dorm rooms. But many of the new co-eds seemed to have different interests. In Town and Gown, the spinster dean sees their differences keenly. The vulgarity of their dress, their frankness, their cigarettes, their dancing, the things they read, the shows they saw, a mad sex swirl. Young women no longer had to choose between men and their studies. The co-ed rebelled by putting romantic adventures at the center of her curriculum. Dating dominated her social life. Outnumbered by her male classmates by ratios of 5 or 6 to 1, she could go out with 3 or 4 different college men every week. So what did a college date look like? It could start as a drive. In his 1928 book, The Campus, Professor Robert Cooley of the University of Michigan argued that the influence of the car on the relations between the sexes could not be overestimated. The ease with which a couple can secure absolute privacy when in possession of a car, and the spirit of reckless abandonment which high-speed and moonlight drives have combined to break down the traditional barriers. What is vulgarly known as petting is the rule rather than the exception. The college man with a car often took a co-ed somewhere. Most towns have areas, I know especially when I lived in a college town, most towns have areas that people call the lookout spot or the necking spot or the makeout spot. So this is what they are referring to here. In his Low Slung Racer, the champion fusser Andy Prothero in his story takes girls to a place called Orpa, a vaudeville theater that is the hottest date spot in town. The entertainment that the college man and co-ed watched together could be salacious. After the show, the college man took the co-ed to eat or drink. The football joint in the story is called You'll Come In. It is a basement establishment with wooden tables, booths, and parchment-shaded lamps, where 2 chocolate malts cost 50 cents. The one naive date is thrilled by it. Her more sophisticated classmates hardly seem to notice the food or jazz music. The couples in the booths about them were petting whenever the watchful manager, watchful in the fear of an edict would ruin his business, was in another part of the place. The most important kind of date a college man and co-ed could go on was a dance. Fraternities hosted slews of formals, as they still do, usually organized around a sporting event or homecoming. Dean Robert Engel estimated that the University of Michigan in the 1920s held 300 dances every year. At co-ed and single-sex universities alike, students invited imports to attend football games and the parties that surrounded them. More clearly than any other activity, these dances distilled and dramatized the principles that governed college dating. The first rule was that sex was a secret that young people kept to themselves. Whereas parents had overseen older forms of courtship, now dating took place as far away as possible from watchful adults. On his way to a dance, the college man would encounter the chaperones, whom university bylaws required to be there. Fraternity hosts became adept at sidetracking them. In the 1924 novel The Plastic Age by Percy Marx, the hero, Hugh Carver, learns how it works as soon as he arrives at his first fraternity dance. 6 men had been delegated to keep the patronesses in the library and adequately entertain. Second, fraternity dances staged intense competition among peers. Both men and women worked hard to rate or merit good dates. Passing the chaps, the college men joined the stag line in the side of the crowded dance floor and waited for his opportunity to cut in or steal a co-ed from her partner. This system dramatized the idea that courtship was a contest. Even when the college man invited a co-ed to a fraternity party, he accepted that his brothers would take turns dancing with her. Indeed, bringing a girl whose dance card would stay full was taken as a sign of his high social status. For the co-ed who wanted to impress her date, the best strategy was to flirt with as many others as possible. To do so cemented her status with her female peers. In Town and Gown, the bitter social climber Ellen Pritchett reflects, quote, "Men were only the gloves with which one slapped the face of girls. It was one woman dueled." Finally, college dances were explicitly sexual. Your sexuality was the currency you put down in play in this arena, where spending money on clothes and flowers and cars and tickets allowed young people to consume one another conspicuously as well. In the same way that my parents used to freak out about how children of the 1990s, guilty, grinded to hip hop, adults in the 1920s panicked about the sexually arousing effects of dancing to jazz music. They fretted about button shiners, boys who danced so close to their partners that they appeared to be burnishing their suit or shirt buttons on their dresses. Crumpet munchers, they called them, who danced close enough, and snuggle pups. Don't ask. And like critics of hip hop, critics of unspeakable jazz expressed their fears in terms that were often racist. Anyone who says that youth of both sexes can mingle in close embrace with limbs intertwined and torsos in close contact without suffering harm lies. Add to this the position of wriggling movement, sensuous stimulation of the abominable jazz orchestra with its voodoo-born minors and its direct appeal to the sensory center. And if you can believe that youth is the same after this experience as before, then God help your child. So, the same sentiments that people have about rap, they have about hip hop, they have about R&B songs and music, and young bodies grinding together on the dance floor looking like they're having sex. Those attitudes and feelings are not new. They felt the same way about jazz when jazz first came out. All right? Jazz, swing, bebop, etc. Got it? Good. Combined with heavy drinking, dances encourage petting and more. When Hugh Carver attends his first party in The Plastic Age, the book, he is frankly shocked to realize how many of the female imports are hammered. The first girl he cuts in on has breath soaked with whiskey. Another one clings to him violently as they dance, whispering, "Hold me up, kid, I'm ginned." He has to rush another girl to the garden so she can vomit. His fellow Greeks do not behave much better. A number of the brothers were hilarious. A few had drunk too much and were sick. One had a crying jag. When the first girl he cut in on accosts Hugh, slurring, "Let's pet," and plants a kiss on him, he runs away. On his way out, he darts into a friend's room to pick up a shawl for a chaperone who accidentally left it there and stumbles in on two people engaged in sexual activity. The way Hugh Carver describes these scenes suggests that a gentleman would not take advantage of a co-ed when she was incapacitated. And now, thankfully, we have laws around that because many of them did take advantage of co-eds when they were incapacitated. Who knows how many real-life college men followed this rule? By the end of The Plastic Age, even the goody two-shoes Hugh has fallen into the fray. At the advice of friends, he buys hooch to pregame his final prom with his girlfriend, Cynthia. By midnight, Hugh was aware of nothing but Cynthia's body. When she asks him to take him somewhere, he leads her to a dorm room full of a dorm room of the straight-laced friend who lives nearest to the party. In a machina move, the friend returns early from his holiday to find them petting on his carpet. It is only this chance event that keeps them from going beyond limits. The mutual embarrassment they feel at the extremity of their behavior breaks them up just in time for his graduation. So, college students may have always misbehaved. In 1752, Yale President Thomas Clapp kicked a student out of the university for sundry riotous and impudent crimes. The kid had gone on a beer-fueled rampage, yelling and jumping, damaging the walls of the rooms of his tutors, and most of all, saying that he did not care if they expelled him. But in the 20th century, with the introduction of women into the mix, attitudes toward what constituted acceptable behavior on college campuses dramatically began to shift. Increasingly, The kinds of authority figures or disciplinarians who had once been chaperones abandoned that supervisory role. They began to leave the kids to work out their own system. A long legal tradition argued that colleges had the right to discipline students in loco parentis, or in the place of their parents. The thinking was that by voluntarily entering a university, or in the case of those under 18, being enrolled by one's guardians, a student surrendered many liberties. In 1913, the Supreme Court of Kentucky upheld the right of the private Berea College to expel students for going to a restaurant across the street from campus. In 1928, a New York appellate court upheld the right of Syracuse University to expel a student for not being a typical Syracuse girl. The opinion argued that if a student harmed the ideals of scholarship or the moral atmosphere of even a public university, she had violated the terms of the contract that she signed in the form of her registration card. The university was therefore entitled to terminate it. Now, again, I said this in another video that this is what happened to one of my friends who came to college, started wilding out, sleeping with everything that moved, and she was warned by the university, but she kept up her behavior, and eventually the university because they said she did not exemplify the moral character of the university. Shocked us all, but it sent a clear message that no, you cannot come on the college campus acting like girls gone wild and think that your college is not going to notice it. All right. And she was a very intelligent student, very bright. But when it came to her social activities, it was bringing a stain and a scar on the campus's reputation. So the university president decided she had to go. In the 1960s, a series of cases brought an end to in loco parentis. Over the course of the decade, judges argued that public universities could no longer expel a student without due process. As more and more undergraduates became active in the civil rights protests, courts also defended their rights to freedom of speech and assembly at school. These decisions had major implications for how college students conducted romantic relationships. Until the 1960s or 70s, Pareto rules had strictly governed the interactions of men and women at both co-ed and single-sex universities, imposing curfews and enforcing intervisitation policies like open door, 1 foot on the floor. Exactly. It is like today with social media and the university and students' conduct. Starting in the late 1960s, however, schools dropped these regulations and more dormitories went co-ed. Because remember, I said, and there are still some co-ed colleges that, again, have all male dorms or all female dorms, because there are still parents who, even though they're sending their children to a co-ed university, still want to allow their child to not be distracted by a co-ed dorm. Because if you've ever lived in a co-ed dorm, you know it can be distracting. All right. In retrospect, it seems clear that the end of in loco parentis was part of a broad shift in how the public viewed higher education. The first American universities were founded to train, get this, ministers. Bum, ba, bum, bum, bum. All right. Let me say that again. The first universities were founded to train ministers, who were actually the second sons of what would have been American nobility and sometimes English nobility, right? Because the first son inherited everything. So they had to decide what the second son would be doing. And usually, all right, the second son either went into the clergyship, all right, and then he would come home from university and they would give him a parish and he would lead that parish. All right. So he either became a minister or a soldier. Those were the two main choices for a second son who did not inherit everything. All right. So if he was wild, more than likely he was like, I am not going into the clergyship. I'll take soldier. Thank you very much. Soldier for 200. Okay. So those were the two main choices until we had the boom of industry, right? And then those second sons became what we call today the captains of industry, because they said, I don't want to be a minister. I sure don't want to get potentially blown into pieces becoming a soldier. So let me go and try this enterprise called business. All right, which is where we get the aristocratic society. These were the men who had made their fortune through business, who were seen as less than the nobility who had inherited their fortunes. All right, and that's a whole other history lesson. But oftentimes the people who were of the nobility class would look down upon those who had earned their money through business. Now it's almost the exact opposite, right? We have a lot of esteem and a lot of respect for people who have made their money through business, as opposed to just sitting around and just collecting money. So the first American universities were founded to train ministers. The secular schools of the 19th and 20th centuries still were thought to perform a key civic function, preparing young people to be productive, democratic citizens. Since the heyday of campus activism in the 1960s and 70s, a new consensus has emerged. Rather than seeing public universities as social good with an important moral vocation, more and more public figures speak about them like businesses. By the 21st century, corporate universities and defunded state schools were allowing students to conduct their private lives pretty much however they wanted. The new philosophy held that students were now customers, and they were always right. Okay? Since the mid-1970s, tuition at private colleges has increased at nearly triple the rate of general inflation. At public institutions, it has more than kind of expense to have a little fun. And so, being an undergrad gives you carte blanche now. If that time you had sex with the student council president in the laundry center, then accidentally emailed the entire staff of the student newspaper about it, ever comes up, you can simply shrug. The photo of you making out in broad daylight, it was college. So the whole notion around college and the concepts of college are changing, which means the attitudes about morality within the college setting is changing, and we can actually see evidence of that. All right, we will continue that next week. Yes, times have really changed. We will continue that next week. We'll continue finishing up about what happened and how dating changed with the advent of schooling. All right, remember, with marriage, in our earlier segment, intimacy in marriage, yada, sacred sex. Sex minus the sacredness is porneo. All right, where we get the current word porn. So, I hope that you've learned something today that you did not know. Remember, this has been another episode of Daring Dialogues. And remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So please go out today and be light. If you can, if you're in a part of the country that is sunny outside, there's no rain, there's no storm, there's no hurricane, there's no tornado on the way, make sure that you enjoy some of today's beautiful sunshine where you are. All right. Take care. Thank you so much for joining us. Please catch the replay and share this broadcast. Take care and God bless.